up? It's Shannon from the Trinisphere, where Timmy, Johnny, and Spike battle over all things EDH. Today I'm here with Rielle the Everwise and a deck list I'm calling Keeping It Real. This Izzet budget deck list is under $100 and it focuses on wheel cards that have us discarding hands and drawing cards to pump Rielle's ability set into a win. Before I dive into this deck list, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon if you want to get notifications when gameplays, deck techs, and podcasts come out. Less so much the podcasts and gameplays these days, but a new set just dropped, so we're going to be churning out deck lists for these commanders from each of our unique points of view, the Timmy, Johnny, and Spike. Of course, I'm the Johnny, so I'll be looking at this deck from the point of view of using underrated, underutilized, cheap, and bad cards and elevating them to the good status through some clever deck design. And Rielle is really quite exemplary in this regard. Rielle the Everwise is a 3-mana 0/3 human wizard that gets +1/+0 for each instant sorcery in our graveyard. So we've seen this effect before on cards like Spellheart Chimera, one of my favorite Izzet creatures. The more we cast spells, the stronger these cards become. But also Rielle has another pretty insane effect that says whenever we discard one or more cards for the first time each turn, draw that many cards. So the first time we discard a card, or 5 cards, or 10 cards on our turn, we draw back that many. Basically, Rielle negates the first time on a turn that we have to discard by replacing those discard effects. So of course, the first when people see this, they're like, oh, well, then you use wheel effects, you use Reforged Soul, Wheel of Fortune, Wheel of Fate, and then it basically doubles the amount you draw. And yeah, that's true. That's a pretty good way to build Rielle. But everyone's also saying that, hey, it's kind of like a bad Nekasar. Rielle has to attack in order to kill people, whereas Nekasar just burns people alive. Also true. So instead, we're going to look to min-max Rielle in a direction that hasn't been really explored before, and that is to focus on cards that use discarding as a drawback to their power level. Cards that used discards your hand to kind of level out how strong they were, because Rielle, of course, completely negates that downside. So it starts to turn a lot of cards into wheel effects plus upside. So we'll go into that in a little bit, but before we get into that, let's talk about how Rielle wins games. So of course, Rielle's power is dynamic, equal to the instant of sorceries in our graveyard. So Rielle is an excellent attacker in a deck that is constantly filling its graveyard up. So we're going to be focusing on doing VOLTRON style deck that uses commander damage or a select few attackers to deal lethal combat damage. So let's dive into the VOLTRON list, the VOLTRON aspects of the list. We're going to run Anger, Artful Dodge, Diviner's Wand, and Maximize Velocity. You can see Anger and Maximize Velocity help give haste, which is useful if they destroy Rielle. We can recast Rielle and then immediately swing, so we can keep applying pressure very quickly. And they also synergize with some of the cards in our deck, some of the creatures in our deck that have tap abilities, which we'll go into a little bit later. Artful Dodge has flashback, giving our creature unblockable, so helps Rielle get through to deal commander damage, keep pressure on even if they're able to create blockers. And then Diviner's Wand is really powerful, one of the few equipment in this deck, but very powerful. This 3-mana wizard equipment tribal gives the equipped creature, whenever you draw a card, this creature gets +1/+1 and flying until end of turn. Also, this creature can pay 4 mana to draw a card, and then it also automatically equips to a wizard whenever a wizard comes into play. Rielle is a wizard, so if Diviner's Wand is in play when we cast Rielle, Diviner's Wand will automatically equip to it. But the most important thing here is that it gives the equipped creature flying whenever it triggers, and it triggers whenever we draw a card, which we do at the beginning of every single turn. So if it's equipped to Rielle at the beginning of our turn, effectively it gives Rielle flying and +1/+1. But on top of that, whenever we start wheeling, it starts adding +6, +7 power and toughness to Rielle, making Rielle much more dangerous due to drawing, due to the number of instant sorceries in your graveyard. Very quickly, Rielle can become a one-shot swing. We're also going to run Runechanter's Pike and Seize the Day. Runechanter's Pike is very similar to Rielle. This 2-mana equipment costs 2 to equip and gives the equipped creature first strike and +X/+0, where X is the number of instant sorceries in our graveyard. So the exact same kind of buff that Rielle already has. So this effectively doubles Rielle's power. If there's 6 instants in our sorceries in our graveyard, Rielle is a 6/3, and then Runechanter's Pike makes Rielle a 12 gives. But most importantly, this can be used to turn regular old flying tokens into more Rielle-type threats. When you have 10 instant sorceries in your graveyard, all of a sudden 1/1 flyers become a serious problem for your opponents when you have Runechanter's Pike equipped to them. We're also going to run Seize the Day, which is the traditional extra attack step for one target creature, and it has flashback, which is why it's going to be in this deck. It can be used to kind of effectively give Rielle double strike. You can swing with Rielle, then flashback Seize the Day from our graveyard to swing a second time to do lethal commander damage. And we're going to be focusing on flashback a lot because, of course, we're going to be wheeling cards from our hand into our graveyard to be reused later. Some bodies that can do a stand-in for Rielle include the original Izzet Rielle analogs, Crackling Drake, Enigma Drake, and Spellheart Chimera. So all of these creatures are similar to Rielle in that their power scales the number of instant sorceries in our graveyard, so they are of course going to be auto-includes. All of these creatures already have flying, so they're also kind of better than Rielle at attacking. So these cards are obviously shoo-ins for doing what we're going to do with Rielle, and then also, you know, carrying Runechanter's Pike in for the win. We're also going to run Drakehaven, Improbable Alliance, Murmuring Mystic, and Young Pyromancer. So our deck is going to be light on creatures, so we're going to rely on these to create additional creatures for our defense, as well as applying pressure if they're able to deal with Rielle. Like I said before, Runechanter's Pike is insane once you give it to a flying creature, and most of these make flying creatures, so when they're getting attacked by an 11/1 flying fairy every turn that has first strike, like it's gonna be backbreaking. So now we talked about how if we have a bunch of instant sorceries in our graveyard, we can use these Voltron style effects and creatures to deal lethal damage to our opponents. But now we gotta talk about how do we fill up our graveyard very quickly and on a budget, because this deck list is around $100. So let's talk about our traditional wheel effects. Now by that I mean cards that have us discard our hand and then draw that many cards. For traditional wheel effects, we're gonna be running Collective Defiance, Flux, Jace's Archivist, and Magus of the Wheel. Jace's Archivist and Magus of the Wheel are those cards I was referring to that definitely benefit from having haste. Magus of the Wheel becomes kind of like a 5-mana Wheel of Fortune, and Jace's Archivist is kind of an insane card in this deck, always kind of a dangerous card whenever somebody plays it, allowing us to wheel over and over and over again. Collective Defiance more traditionally is a sorcery that has us discard our hand and draw that many, and then it also has some escalate abilities to deal damage to creatures or opponents. And then Flux is an interesting one. It's probably might actually end up getting cut because it's a little dangerous. It allows each player to discard any number of cards in their hand to draw back that many. So it allows our opponents, instead of just losing their hand and getting a new one, they're able to sculpt the hand they have by discarding the cards they don't want and keeping the ones they do. So then this in a sense is worse than a normal wheel, but it does have tacked on drawing us an additional card. And then as a reminder, with Rielle in play, anytime we discard cards, we draw that many. So if we cast Flux and we have 6 cards in our hand, we just discard 6. Flux will draw us 7, and then Rielle will trigger to draw us an additional 6. So we draw 13. So you can see how Rielle starts to warp how cards work whenever they use discarding your hand as a downside. We're gonna run Neheb Dreadhorde Champion, Shattered Perception, Tolarian Winds, and Windfall to round out our wheel effects. Neheb triggers whenever we deal combat damage and then gives us mana in addition to the cards it replaces. You hit a player, you discard 5, you draw 5 from Neheb, 5 from Rielle, you have 10 cards in your hand and 5 red mana in your pool. You can see how that can get out of hand really quick. Shattered Perception has flashback, so we can use it at our graveyard. And then Tolarian Winds and Windfall are traditionally sorceries and instants that allow us to discard our hand and draw. Tolarian Winds is pretty good because we can use it on opponent's turns. So let's talk about some of the cards that are not traditionally wheels, but Rielle kind of changes how they work. And if we reframe how we think about these cards, they start becoming wheel effects with upside. Maybe a wheel effect that leaves a creature behind, or a wheel effect that has bonus effects tacked onto it. And that's when you really start to see how Rielle is kind of a bananas commander. So first let's talk about Avaricious Dragon, Bedlam Reveler, and Ox of Agonis. These cards traditionally are powerful creatures that either have you discard your hand as a downside, or they refill your hand at the cost of discarding it. Avaricious Dragon is a 4-mana 4/4 flyer. That's at the beginning of your draw step, draw an additional card. So it's like a living Phyrexian Arena, or like a Blood Gift Demon, perhaps. At the beginning of your end step, you discard your hand, which normally is such an egregious downside that no one would ever run Avaricious Dragon. But Rielle now completely changes how that card works. This is a 4-mana 4/4 flyer that draws you extra cards every turn. And at the beginning of your end step, you refresh your hand. You discard your hand and then draw a new one. So you get to play the best cards in your hand, and then leaving junk in your hand, lands and stuff you don't want. And then the Avaricious Dragon just says, throw all those away and get a new one. And then now it's chock full of instants that you can use in opponent's turns, recycling cards, that kind of thing. Bedlam Reveler and Ox of Agonis are pretty good cards in their own right. They're used in other formats. Bedlam Reveler is an 8-mana 3/4 that costs 1 less for each instant or sorcery in your graveyard, has prowess, and says when it enters the battlefield, discard your hand and draw 3. So normally, if you have 6 instant sorcery in your graveyard, this is a 2-mana 3/4 creature that has prowess that draws you like 3 cards when it comes into play. That's how it's normally used. However, in this deck, it becomes even better. It's a wheel effect. It allows you to discard 5, 6 cards, and then you draw that many plus 3. So discard 5 cards, draw 8 for 2 mana. And then on top of that, you get a 3/4 with prowess. So you can see how Rielle starts to change how you look at cards. They become wheels with upside. Similar, Ox of Agonis is a 5-mana 4/2. Discard your hand, draw 3. But it also has Escape, which means this card is very good in this deck. You can bin it early on a wheel, and then later on you can escape it by exiling 8 other cards from your graveyard. So if we once again word it as if it were a wheel effect, this is a 2-mana wheel, and it has Delve. Let's say it has Delve. And then for that, we're left with a 5/3, and then we also draw 3 cards when we wheel, on top of whatever we wheel. So discard 5 cards, draw 8, get a 5/3 body. left behind. Pretty insane. And the last ones we want to talk about that are wheel-esque before we go on to the next section are the cards Breakthrough, Dangerous Wager, and Rites of Initiation. Breakthrough, I think, is the most insane example of how Rielle subverts how cards work. This is a unplayable card that says for X and a blue, draw 4 cards, then choose X cards in your hand and discard the rest. You get to draw 4 cards, but then you only get to keep X cards, X being how much you paid into it. So normally I'd say you'd use this card, maybe X equals 1. You're really digging for a removal spell to not die this turn, so you cast Breakthrough, X equals 1. Look at the top 4 cards of your library. Is one of those a removal spell? Yes. Okay, you get to keep that card and discard the rest of your hand and then cast your removal spell. But in Rielle, we're never going to pay for X. X is always going to be 0. Breakthrough says, with Rielle in play, for 1 blue mana, draw 4 cards, then discard your hand and then draw that many cards. You can see how that starts to get a little freaking ridiculous. So let's talk about Dangerous Wager. It's kind of the worst of the tormenting voice cycle. For 2 mana, we discard our hand to draw 2 cards, but if we look at it through the lens of Rielle, then now we're talking about 2 mana, wheel your hand and draw 2 extra cards. At instant speed, by the way, so we can use this on opponent's turns. And then Rites of Initiation, another interesting one. For a single red, discard any number of cards at random, and then each creature we control gets +1/+0 until end of turn for each card discarded this way. So this is kind of a pump spell. If we have a bunch of fairies or drakes from those token generators, or maybe even elementals from Young Pyromancer, we can use Rites of Initiation to absolutely just kill everyone in one giant swing as an overrun style effect. Even outside of that, this is a 1 mana wheel effect. For a single red, we can discard our hand and draw a new hand, and then we get upside, which is that we pump our board. And it's also instant speed, so we can do it on opponent's turns. So let's talk about cards that synergize with wheel effects. We have Glinthorn Buccaneer, Library of Lang, and Surly Badgersaur. Glinthorn Buccaneer deals damage to each of opponent whenever you discard a card, so this will just incidentally, if they don't kill it immediately, our Sneaky Gutter Snipe. This will just burn down people, just tons of damage, 5, 6, 7 damage every single turn, maybe multiple times a turn. Library of Lang, really useful artifact. This 1 mana artifact says we have no maximum hand size, which can get really ridiculous. And then it says whenever we discard a card, we may put it on top of our library instead of our graveyard. So this helps us sculpt. Whenever we wheel, we want to keep counter spells or other wheels, we can just discard those to the top of our deck, and then when Rielle triggers for us to draw, we just draw them back into our hand. And then Surly Badgersaur is a new card. It's kind of like a Bone Miser, a red Bone Miser. This 4 mana 3/3 Badger Dinosaur says whenever you discard a creature card, put a +1/+1 counter on me, and then whenever you discard a land card, create a treasure. So generates mana when we're discarding lands. Very, very important. And then whenever you discard a non-creature non-land, Surly Badgersaur fights. So that allows us to remove creatures. Surly Badgersaur becomes like a removal and mana generating effect whenever we have Rielle in play, and whenever we're wheeling like crazy. Let's go on to our ramp removal and draw. For ramp, we have Izzet, Signet, Soul Ring, and Talisman of Creativity. It's kind of a small package. It's kind of light. Our average CMC is below 3, and our commander only costs 3, so we're not going to emphasize ramp that much, and we're able to do a lot with very little mana. But this is an area that could be improved in this deck if we want to dump some more money into the deck and improve its power level. The ramp section definitely could use a buff, but it's not necessary for kind of the casual levels. For removal, we have a ton of it in the instant sorcery form, because of course we want to be able to cast spells, interact with our opponents, and then fill up our graveyard with instant sorceries the old-fashioned way, resolving removal. So for targeted removal, we have Chaos Warp, Commit to Memory, Conflagrate, and Counterflux. Chaos Warp I run in like every red deck. It just deals with all kinds of threats. It's a go-to in casual EDH. Commit to Memory, I usually do not run this one, but we need the memory side, the aftermath side, in case we get to a point where we're about to mill ourselves out, which is very possible in this deck. And you just churn through so many cards in this deck that having memory in your graveyard allows you to go, whew, I didn't kill everyone yet. Let me just shuffle everything back in and start over. Conflagrate is a really bad burn spell. This spell is XX in a red to deal X damage divided among any number of targets, which is like half as powerful as a normal red burn spell. Like, compare this to Comet Storm, probably one of the better ones. This one is really bad, but this has flashback. For 2 red, discard X cards to deal X damage divided among any number of targets or players. If we reframe this from Rielle's point of view, this is a wheel effect that does damage when we wheel. So if we flash it back from our graveyard, we pay 2 red and we discard 7 cards, we draw 7 cards and deal 7 damage spread however we want. So we can kill 7 tokens, bring down a Titan, that kind of thing. So Conflagrate, way better out of the graveyard with Rielle in play. Counterflux needs no introduction. It's a classic Izzet uncounterable counterspell. So let's move on to Fateful Showdown, Forbid, Negate, and Rites of Refusal. Fateful Showdown is another wheel that does damage to a single target, that instant speed, which is really good. So we can cast this, deal damage to target creature or player equal to the number of cards in our hand, and then we discard our hand and draw that many cards. And of course, Rielle says, draw double that many cards. Come on. So this is a good burn spell. Got instant speed, Forbid is like one of my favorite go-to casual counterspells. This 3 mana counterspell has buyback, discard 2 cards. So normally the way you beat Forbid, Izzet player who probably isn't tapping out, is always keeping their mana open, is you run them out of card advantage in their hand, but Rielle just completely negates that downside. Every time you cast Forbid and discard 2 cards, you draw 2 more cards off of Rielle. So Forbid just becomes a never-ending torment for your opponents. Negate, I always run Negate in my EDH decks. I always feel like non-creature counterspells are more important than creature-centric counterspells. And then we have Rights of Refusal. This 2 mana counterspell says, for 2 mana, discarding number of cards from your hand, counter target spell unless its owner pays 3 for each. So it's like a really bad mana leak, but once again, if we look at this through the lens of Rielle's reality, Rights of Refusal says, discard your hand, draw a new hand, and then counter target spell for 2 mana. We're also going to run Spite of Mogus, Stubborn Denial, and Unwind. Spite of Mogus similarly counts a number of instant sorceries in our graveyard to deal damage to a target creature. Then also scries 1. So this is like a single red destroy target creature ability. I mean, it's going to do so much damage that unless the creature's like a 25-25, Spite of Mogus is just going to kill it for 1 mana. Stubborn Denial, really good at defending Rielle when we recast Rielle, because Rielle will almost always have more than 4 power and toughness, so Stubborn Denial is a 1 mana negate. And then Unwind, very good at countering on somebody's turn, then untapping your mana so that you can then use a cycle or an instant speed wheel effect to restock your hand. Moving on to board wipes, we have Aetherize, Firestorm, Flood of Tears, and Nahiri's Wrath. You can see Firestorm and Nahiri's Wrath both similarly have us discard cards from our hand and then deal damage equal to either the number of cards we discarded or to the total CMC of the cards we discard. But, you know, we reframe those through Rielle's lens as discard your hand, draw a new hand, then burn down a bunch of creatures. Then we have Aetherize and Flood of Tears, able to deal with aggressive opponents, or in the case of Flood of Tears, able to deal with maybe a combo player in the corner who has built up a crazy board state. Just unsummon everything and put Rielle back into play. We're also going to run Turbulent Dreams. Similarly, this 2 mana sorcery says discard X cards from your hand to bounce X non-land permanents to their owner's hand. With Rielle, that means wheel your hand, discard your hand, draw a new hand, and then bounce non-land permanents equal to the number of cards you just wheeled. For draw, we're going to look at some cards that are similar to wheel effects, but they're kind of like smaller scale. They don't discard your entire hand, they discard some number of cards and draw a number of cards. All still very good. We're just going to keep abusing Rielle's discard effect. We're going to be running Burning Inquiry, Cathartic Reunion, Curator of Mysteries, and Faithless Looting. Cathartic Reunion and Faithless Looting, generally speaking, do get run a lot in a lot of EDH decks, so it's not surprised to see them here. They just get so much better in this deck. Burning Inquiry is another really good one. For a single red, each player draws 3, then discards 3 at random, and then of course Rielle will trigger to draw us an additional 3. So this is a single red, you draw 6, discard 3. We're also going to run Frantic Search, Izzet Charm, Magus of the Bazaar, Nezahal, Primal Tide. Nezahal is, if anyone's ever had to play against an EDH, is an absolute nightmare to deal with. The 7 mana 7/7 can't be countered, increases your hand size to infinity. Whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, you draw a card, and then you can discard 3 cards to exile Nezahal and then put it back into play at the beginning of the next end step. So it has its own built-in protection from removal. So it's like a Mystic Remora attached to a 7/7 that's hard to kill. Like this thing absolutely slaps. Its big downside is discarding 3 cards to protect it. So you can, generally speaking, rally up with the other players in a pod to bring down Nezahal by burning out the hand of the owner of Nezahal. But of course, Rielle completely changes that dynamic. Whenever you discard 3 cards to Nezahal, you draw 3 cards off of Rielle. So you never lose cards protecting Nezahal. And you can just do it whenever you want. It doesn't have to be in response to anything. You just be like, when you go to end step, I'm just gonna flicker Nezahal and you can draw 3 new cards. Get rid of 3 lands. We're also gonna run Thought Scour and Thrill of Possibility. Thought Scour, we want to use that as an early game cantrip to start filling up our graveyard with instants and sorceries. And Thrill of Possibility is an instant speed tormenting voice, so very good to use on other people's turns, because of course Rielle only triggers on the first time each turn. So we want to wheel on our turn, then we want to wheel on your turn, then we want to wheel on your turn. So these instant speed wheel effects are pretty important. Let's talk about our recursion, our last category, before we go to lands. We have a few recursion cards in here, including Backdraft Hellkite, Mission Briefing, Mystic Retrieval, and Rise from the Tides. I'm really excited about Backdraft Hellkite. I have not gotten a chance to play it in EDH yet. It's 5 mana 4/4 flyer, says whenever it attacks, each instant and sorcery in our graveyard gains flashback. So we can use that to flashback Rites of Initiation, that 1 red spell that lets us wheel our hand and pump our board, to just completely surprise all my 1/1 flyers become 7/1 flyers. Mission Breathing is an instant speed version of Snapcaster Mage, able to give any of our wheels or counter spells in our graveyard flashback effectively. Mystic Retrieval has flashback itself, and it puts a instant or sorcery in our hand, so it's very, very good card. You want to go ahead and just discard this early game, and then, because strangely enough, the flashback cost is cheaper than the casting cost, so it's better out of your graveyard than in your hand. And then Rise from the Tides gives us 2/2s into play tapped for each instant sorcery in our graveyard. So So it's kind of like our blue Army of the Damned effect. We cast this, and it'll be like close to 12, 13, 14 instants of sorceries in our graveyard, making us an army of attackers. So that rounds out the list, but let's talk about the lands real quick because it is important. We are running every single cycling land we can get our hands on. Well, not the deserts, but we're gonna run Ash Barrens and Blasted Landscape. Ash Barrens has basic land cycling, so it's effectively a fixer. Blasted Landscape is the colorless cycling land. We're gonna run both of those. Very good in this deck. We're also gonna run the cheaper colored ones, the Forgotten Cave, Lonely Sandbar, Remote Isle, and Smoldering Crater. These are the on-color Izzet cycling lands. Then we're gonna run the lands that can activate to cycle. We're going to run Desolate Lighthouse and Gaia Reach Sanitarium. And then we're going to round out the list with a Command Tower and a Mystic Sanctuary. Mystic Sanctuary able to put an instant sorcery from our graveyard back on top of our library. And then we're going to also run 13 islands and 12 mountains. So we're running a lot of cycle lands because, of course, we can cycle them on opponent's turns. We can keep mana open for our counter spells or removal. And then when they don't do anything of relevance or they attack somebody else, we can cycle these lands to draw extra cards. Normally, they just replace themselves like cantrips, but Rielle says discard a land, draw 2 cards is really good to be doing on other people's turns because this deck does flood out, draws so many cards, so many lands, can only play about 1 a turn. So that rounds out this Rielle deck list, keeping it Rielle. Let me know what you guys think. I'm pretty excited about using all these underutilized discard your hand style cards to become absolute wheel plus upside banana shenanigans. I'm ready to show it off to my friends. As soon as this quarantine's over, I'm going to start playing Rielle against my buddies and showing off this build. But if you want to see more deck text, there's going to be plenty more coming out because there's nothing better to do these days. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon. And if you want to buy this deck list, there'll be a link below to it on TCG Player. I think it's right about $100, a little under $100, not including basics. So this is a pretty affordable and I think pretty strong list. I think the power level comes into around, I think this deck is around a 5 on the power level, so usually it'll beat a precon out the box. And then if you want to normalize it to be less janky, you can add some more Izzet staples, which will probably push it up into the 6 range. And then if you were to add a bunch of money on top of that, increase its speed by ramping and tutoring for cards you need, then it'll probably get up to the 7 range. So it's right in that range right there. And I think this deck is really a lot of fun, and I'm really excited to play it against friends. All right, this is Shannon, the Johnny, signing off. As always, great minds brew alike. Catch you next time.